what I'd like to do is start by quoting directly from our final century. And Sir Martin's words, the gravity of a threat is its magnitude multiplied by its probability. This is how we estimate our concern about hurricanes, asteroids, and epidemics. If we apply this calculus to future man-made risks that confront us, adding them all together, the doomsday clock will shift even closer to midnight. And since he wrote those words, the doomsday clock has shifted to 100 seconds, the closest it's ever been. And much of what we're talking about informed the decision to move that clock forward. But of course, no subject is forging ahead faster than biotechnology, and its advances will intensify the risks and enhance their variety. I will pepper this brief overview of risks in all of biotechnology with quotations from our final century. They'll be in blue and in bold, and so you'll see them here and there as I go through my remarks. But the overall structure of this brief talk will be based on the headings that are found in chapter 9 of the book. Our final experiment, what risks are acceptable, who should decide, and what is the hidden cost of saying no. Our final experiment at the center, our big experiment at the center, is thinking about predicting and preparing for pandemics. And we work to protect people's health from epidemics and disasters and ensure that our communities are resilient to major challenges. So the three faces of pandemics across the ages: Peter Bergel, the Elder, the Triumph of Death. In the 16th century, we are all thinking and rereading information about the pandemic 1918 flu. And of course, here is our current pandemic shot from a stand-up hospital in India in June of this year. But what I'd like to do is describe something that up in the right-hand corner here, Event 201. And this was an exercise that took place sponsored by the Center for Health Security, the World Bank, and Gates Foundation, which was carried on October 18th of 2019, so just about a year ago. And the structure of this exercise, a tabletop exercise shown above, was to reconstruct 4 separate meetings of something called the Pandemic Emergency Board. The participants were 8 executives from multinational companies, representatives of national and international NGOs, and 2 leaders of health agencies, China CDC and US CDC. So the organizations and companies represented at this discussion were the Marriott International, the World Bank, UPS for getting information and packages around and transporting material, the Lufthansa Group, Johnson & Johnson in medical countermeasure production and distribution, and so on. And just briefly, the scenario that these participants were asked to respond to involved a fictional coronavirus called coronavirus acute pulmonary syndrome virus, or CAPS. And this was fictional, and we designed it to represent a strain from the same family of viruses as SARS and MERS that had one mutation to allow spillover into pigs, and a second mutation that enabled efficient human-to-human transmission. And we included also transmission by mild cases, although we did not go so far as to stay asymptomatic, which we're dealing with in the current pandemic. Along the bottom, these are the dates of the 4 hypothetical or fictional meetings that were held: early October, early November, late November, and then mid-December. And you can see the spread of the virus across the country, starting out in Brazil in pigs, and then moving from an early transmission event in China. 50% of this hypothetical virus these cases required hospitalization. The fatality rate in hospitals was 14%. The overall case fatality rate was 7%. The average R0 was 1.74. That ranges, of course. There was no licensed vaccine, just the beginning of one based on SARS and MERS, as was the situation with us, with our situation here. And there was no antiviral drug, but one fictional HIV antiviral maybe worked. And so considering how to ramp up manufacturing and distribution of this antiviral or to develop a vaccine were part of the calculus in the response of these of these participants. Here are the data that were presented on for the first day. You can see early outbreak in Brazil, and then a couple of cases here and there, Ecuador, Chile, in the United States and China. And then projections in the bottom right. This fictional pandemic started to spread very efficiently in low-income, densely packed neighborhoods of megacities in South America. Exported to Portugal, through Brazil, United States, and China. Some countries were able to control it. No vaccine would probably be available within a year, at least within a year. The whole human population was susceptible. Here we are on November 7th. And during the initial months of the pandemic, the cumulative number of cases increased in our exercise exponentially. We expected and heard from the participants great disruptions to trade and travel. An estimate global GDP drop of about 4% in the first 6 months, high unemployment, runaway inflation, national instability, and changes in the global political landscape. There are many needs. We're in November now, not enough money, health response is insufficient, failing economies, and floundering businesses around the world. The support for failing health systems in low and middle income countries could cost upwards of 500 billion. Approaching $1 trillion. Without financial support, economic failures would lead to government collapse in parts of the world. There's the last hypothetical meeting, fictional meeting was in mid-December at the 3 or 4 month point with 12 million cases and 1 million deaths. At this point in the discussion, we looked carefully and talked about mis and disinformation and the role of misinformation and disinformation in really leading to a devastating response effect. We've seen that happen. Healthcare workers under attack, pharmaceutical companies accused of introducing the virus itself in order to, for profit. And in fact, the bottom line is that the global public faced a crisis of confidence and doesn't know who to trust. So the pandemic itself ended at the 18-month point with 65 million deaths. At that point, we asked the participants to think about recommendations. They're listed here. We won't go through them in gory detail, but you can see that we talked about how global businesses should recognize the potential economic burden, that WHO needs to create additional stockpiles of medical countermeasures and PPE. We need to assess and increase pandemic financial support, and that we need to assign greater priority to develop methods to combat misinformation and disinformation related to the pandemic response. I would say that our final experiment was then used to accuse the Center for Health Security. We've been combating our own misinformation and disinformation issues with various conspiratorial groups accusing us, the Center for Health Security, of having planned the entire event, Gates and the World Economic Forum as well. So we're constantly battling that. So moving then on, and having described our approach to thinking about catastrophic biological risk, which is to carry out such exercises as one approach, what risks are acceptable? And Sir Martin discusses, as a physicist and a cosmologist, such risks coming from experiments that involve subatomic particle collision, which are truly remarkable discussions. But what I'd like to talk about are experiments based on something that he said in 2003, which is that after 2020, sophisticated manipulation of viruses and cells will become commonplace. He was right. We can now synthesize pretty much any virus, no matter how complex, in the laboratory in an afternoon. And as DNA synthetic techniques become more and more sophisticated and are about to actually expand through enzymatic DNA synthesis into being able to synthesize entire genes in one sitting, we can see that the synthesis of new viruses will become an issue. Sir Martin reviews current status in 2003 of biotechnology, looking at these kinds of issues. And we now, of course, have had, you'll recognize, of course, Kawaoka and Fouchier on the left here, who were thrown into the spotlight in 10 years after the book was published in 2011 for having reconstructed flu viruses to search for specific alterations in the genome that would lead to that would convert an avian or bird flu into a flu that could be transmitted human to human. And on the right, we see the ferrets, and ferrets are, you know, a most excellent model for human exchange. So the revelation of these experiments that were ongoing and supported by the NIH in the US led to about half a decade of crisis. The risks and benefits were the first focus. The initial reactions were concern over allowing this kind of information to be used by bad actors. So it was really a security issue at first, that publication would provide access to bad actors or people with some kind of malign intent. The argument against that was often that there isn't enough skill out there for people to recreate these kinds of viruses on their own outside of sophisticated laboratories. I think we all agree that that probably is going by the wayside with the enormous talent and expansion of do-it-yourself biology. And the whole issue gradually morphed from a sort of biosecurity concern into a biosafety concern, and the issue of lab accidents, which I won't talk about today in my introductory remarks, but maybe we can get to in the question and answer period. Quoting Sir Martin again, experimenters should be cautious in pushing the envelope of science. Even if there were a case for, semicolon in the wrong place here, but even if there were a case for putting the brakes on some research, a moratorium could never be effectively enforced worldwide. So in the wake of the revelations in 2011-12 of these so-called gain-of-function experiments, there was first a 60-day voluntary moratorium. That was in January of 2012. The moratorium was continued beyond the 60 days throughout 2012. Research was resumed in 2013. In the US, there was in the US, the US government declared a moratorium with no endpoint. And in the interim, between 2014 and 2017, so for 3 years, were a series of meetings carried out by the national academies and attended and committed to by a huge international consortium. A series of reports, commissioned reports, and a sort of risk-benefit analysis was commissioned as well. And in December of 2017, the US lifted the moratorium and offered guidance on how to proceed with these so-called gain-of-function experiments. These limitations were focused on flu and coronavirus, influenza and coronavirus specifically. And in February of 2019, the experiments resumed. Highly controversial that these experiments resumed. There was not much fanfare. They just kind of started happening again. And so there was a lot of argument in the press, in the US press. And that scientific debate is not going away. There are basically two groups, and they've loosely binned themselves into two organizations, the Scientists for Science, who stress the value of the experiments and understanding ability to control pandemic flu, and I'll illustrate that how they might be right. And then those who are against, who emphasize the inherent dangers and accidents and the limited benefit. The two camps remain polarized to this day. And in fact, the whole situation has now been politicized. This is an article in April of 2020 describing how the US State Department issued a series of cables back in 2018 that were worried about safety issues at Wuhan lab studying bat coronaviruses. And there were gain-of-function experiments going on at that time. However, as Sir Martin points out, he refers to his colleague Hutt. Hutt and I realized that one way of checking whether an experiment is safe would be to see whether nature has already done it for us. And I think we have an occasion here to look at a new influenza, strain of influenza, which has been nicknamed G4. An important study came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science a month or two ago, describing a 7-year surveillance program in China following flu as intermediate host. This surveillance system following pigs who are sort of mixing vessels were surveyed over these 7 years, and in the pigs were found avian-like influenza, H1N1 influenza, resembling the pandemic strain of 2009, which is important, and a triple reassortment of genes, internal genes in the virus that represent a triple reassortment between avian, human, and pig. And so nature itself is mixing and matching and doing gain of function experiments for us. And so I would argue that that these are strains that WHO, CDC, obviously China CDC are watching extremely carefully. Europe as well. There have been 2 human cases outside of China. Even there are 10% of swine workers in China are seropositive, even higher among younger workers, 18 to 35, and about a 4% seroconversion, recognizing this G4 influenza in the general population in China. There appears to be no cross-reaction at all. There are no antibodies in non-exposed individuals that would recognize no pre-existing immunity in humans to this virus. So I bring up G4 just because we should all be thinking about it, but also because G4 shows us that nature has been doing these gain of function experiments for us, and following them carefully in these surveillance studies are key as we prepare really, for the next pandemic. So in conclusion, if Sir Martin were to conjecture where the cutting edge will advance the fastest, he would plump for the interface between biology and engineering. This is taken from the third, I think, of his essays in his collection From Here to Eternity, published in 2011. And I would also be both irresponsible and incomplete if I did not mention the Biological Weapons Convention in concluding my short presentation. Is it equipped to deal with 21st century threats? I would argue yes. This is the first article, which is the concluding, the major article that informs all the rest of the aspects of the Biological Weapons Convention, microbial or other biological agents. And I think what we've done in this brief survey is to think about the other kinds of agents that are coming down the road ahead of us. And importantly, the weapons or means of delivery. In some ways, these are more important than the weapons themselves. So this is really one of the largest yearly gatherings of people from all walks of life who are concerned about the future. And I would urge all of us to support its maintenance and the implementation of its of the articles and the regime as we move deeper into the 4th Industrial Revolution. Thanks very much for your time.